Welcome dear students to yet another lecture on the history of English literature. Now we are beginning the discussion of the second module of our syllabus. We have already completed the first unit in which we discussed the Victorian era, the Victorian period. Now in this unit we shall discuss the early 20th century and we will discuss about the social reforms that took place in the early 20th century, the social reformation of Britain during the early 20th century, the First World War and some of the war poets, and we shall also discuss about modernism and some modern poets and writers. We shall begin our discussion of the first lecture of the second unit of our syllabus today. So the early 20th century. Now the early 20th century spanned from 1901 to 1939. 1901 to 1939. The Victorian era ended with the death of Queen Victoria in 1901. Now the monarchs who reigned England from 1901 to 1939 are the following. We need to remember just the monarchs who of the early 20th century. Now Edward VII, who ruled from 1901 to 1910. He would assume the throne on 22nd January 1901 and he would rule England till his death in 1910. He was the eldest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The second monarch that we can remember is George V. He ruled England from 1910 to 1936. Now, George V was king of the United Kingdom and the whole British dominions, the British Empire, and he was the Emperor of India from 6th May 1910 until his death in 1936. After the death of King George V, we find the accession and the abdication of King Edward VIII in 1936. Now King Edward VIII was the King of England and the dominions of the whole British Empire and the Emperor of India from 20th January 1936 until his abdication on 11th December of 1936. He just ruled for almost a year. He would abdicate after a controversy. Why did he give up his throne? He wanted to marry Valley Simpson, an American who had divorced her first husband and was waiting to divorce her second husband, Valley Simpson. Now this marriage was opposed by the prime ministers of UK as well as the British dominions all over the world. Now such marriage was unwelcome as it would have conflicted with his status as the titular head of the Church of England as well. So therefore he would choose to marry Wallis instead of being the monarch of England. He would abdicate in 1936. After the abdication of Edward VIII, we have the accession of George VI. He ruled from 1936 to 1952. Now, George VI was the king of United Kingdom and the dominion of the British Commonwealth from 11th December 1936 up to his death in 1952. My dear students, the early 20th century can be divided into two phases, the early phase and the later phase. Now the early phase is from 1901 to 1918. We know 1918, that was the end of the First World War. So the first phase is up to the end of the First World War. Now this phase also is known as the Edwardian or the Georgian era, and we also see the birth of modernism in this early phase. The later phase is between 1918 and 1939. Now 1918 is the end of the First World War, 1939 the beginning of Second World War. So this is the interwar years. My dear students, there was stability and peace and growth during the reign of Queen Victoria. Now the end of the Victorian era marked the end of stability that strengthened England for so long. There was no more that peaceful ambience as in the times of Victorian England. We shall discuss about the Boer War. The Boer War that took place between 1899 to 1902. It is the second Boer War, or also known as Anglo-Boer War. The Boer War was fought between the British and the Boers. This was also known as I said, the second Boer War. The first war was fought from 1880 and 1881 between the British and the Boers of the Transvaal. Now the South African Republic was known as the Transvaal under the British administration. The second Boer War was fought between the British and the Boers. So the war is between the British and the Boers. Now who are the Boers? The Boers were the Dutch farmers of the Orange Free State and the South African Republic. The Orange Free State and the South African Republic, they constituted the Boers. The Orange Free State was the independent Boer sovereign republic in South Africa during the second half of the 19th century. Now, it ceased to exist after it was defeated and surrendered to the British Empire at the end of the Second Boer War in 1902. Thus, the Boer War was fought between the Britishers and the Boers, and the Boers consisted of the Orange Free State and the South African Republic. Now, how did the war take place? What triggered the war was the discovery of diamonds and gold in the Boer states. The exploitative, the Britishers wanted to take away these diamonds and golds. It was the Boers that would strike first. They were well armed and prepared for the war. They wanted to protect the resources. The British army was unprepared. So the Boers would start the war. The initial victory was for the Boers, but the Britishers would bring in large number of soldiers and ammunition, and they will fight back. And in the end, the British army seized control of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, the South African Republic. They were defeated. And the civilian leaders would go into hiding or exile. In conventional terms, we can say the war was over. The Boers were defeated, but the war continued for years with the Boer guerrilla warfare. The British were successful in suppressing the Boers, but they became aware of the hostile attitude of other European countries towards the Britishers, the mighty Britishers. This surprised them, and the Britishers began to enter into different alliances with the different countries like Japan, France, etc. And slowly we see the whole world is moving towards the First World War. So my dear students, in this first lecture, we have just introduced the early 20th century. We mentioned the different monarchs who ruled Britain in this period, the early 20th century. The period is divided into two phases, we said, the early phase and the later phase. We also mentioned about the Second Boer War. Thank you for your patient listening. We shall meet to discuss the social reforms of this particular period, early 20th century, in our next lecture. Have a nice time. Please stay safe. For the assignment, please write a short description, a summary of what we have discussed today, the early 20th century and the Boer War.